Welcome to Southern Salon Podcast. I'm Amy Clark Spain, and we're so glad you're with us today. We're excited to have author Karen Salyer McElmurray to talk about her new novel today. So welcome, Karen.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here and have a chance to talk with you. Like you say, it's been a crazy time, and just the chance to sit and talk about writing is so pleasing to me.
Yeah, we're all of us are educators, and so we're all dealing with this interesting way of remote teaching, and we could do a whole podcast on that alone, but we won't. We're going to take a break from that and talk about books because that's fun. I met Karen several years ago. So Karen, do you remember the first time we met? Did we meet at Heinemann or did we meet at the Writing Project workshop at the Breaks?
We met I'm almost certain we met at the Breaks. At least that's what I remember the most vividly. That place was just magical in so many ways.
It was. You came to do a writing workshop with the Appalachian Writing Project, which is an organization of teachers, a nonprofit organization. And it was, like you said, it was magical. The place was beautiful, and we workshopped, and I think we did a fireside chat, under the moonlight. I mean, I think we did all these wonderful things, but you had just written Surrendered Child,
I had.
Your memoir. And I remember that was my first introduction to your writing, and I read the whole thing in one night. Like, I took it back to my room and I read the entire thing in one night. I couldn't put it down. It was just so beautifully written.
I'm just so amazed that you would say that. I'm so aware that book is, it's a lot. There's a lot of pain there, as well as, I hope, a lot of forgiveness and beauty, and that you were able to sit with it in that way is kind of amazing to me.
Right. It was. It absolutely was. I was not a mother yet. I guess maybe that was one of the reasons. I don't know. I didn't have that frame of reference, but your writing is so beautiful. It's like poetry. And I know your background, I know you have some background in poetry, but it certainly shines through in how lyric your writing is. And maybe before we get into the novel, we're going to talk about Wanting Radiance, but I wondered if we could touch on this book just a little bit.
I'd be happy to. I think they're all connected for me. All of the books I've done, all of the writing, many.
So Surrendered Child is your story about your teenage pregnancy, putting up a newborn child for adoption in the early 1970s, your journey to adulthood, and then coming back around to that adult son. That's been 16 years ago, right? 2004 was your publication date. What is this about for you now?
Oh, that is it's a challenging and kind of a good, solid question for me. I mean, when I wrote that book back then, when I met you at the Breaks, I was still sort of in the process of it. I wrote that book as a draft, and it was going to be at one small press called Hill Street. And they held on to it for quite a long time, almost like the pregnancy that I write about went long, almost into the 10th month. And so it was like waiting for this thing to be born. And finally the book was written, and it was published by University of Georgia Press. And then suddenly, lo and behold, because of the writing of that book, I met my son. His girlfriend of that time was looking online by writing by Kentucky women, and she saw me, and she saw an excerpt from the book. It was My Son's Birthday was the title of that chapter. And she wrote me, and she said, my fiance, she called him, has long wanted to meet his mother. Would you be willing to talk? And I, about fell on the floor. That was what it was like. So that was then, then was sort of like being at the Breaks with you, that conference you described. There was all this beautiful morning fog I would wake up with, and then the fog would be there, and then the sun would melt it away, and gradually this beautiful day would be born. That's sort of what that time was like. It was sort of fog and waiting for light to permeate this fog of of giving birth to this book, and that was this difficult subject. Mm-hmm. And now all these years have passed. I've gotten some perspective on it. I haven't written about that subject again, but I may well be ready to. I've known my son since back then. He now teaches in China. He's in Beijing. And I hear from him only very rarely. I mean, when we talk, we have a connection, but it's not what I imagined it would be. Maybe it's what mothers have. I don't really know,
Mhm.
but it's come to a different place, and I've come to a great deal of peace with it. So I guess that's where I am with that book. I mean, I have it's sort of like looking through a long telescope, and I see myself back there at the breaks in that fog, and then coming to talk with y'all and finding words for language for that experience.
Mhm.
And now here I am this time later finding a new language. Does that make sense, any of
Yes,
that?
yes, that's a beautiful image too.
Well, at the time that I wrote it, I had actually just finished. That was in like 2000, something like that. I had maybe 1999. I had just finished my first novel. It's called Strange Birds in the Tree of Heaven. And I was in a graduate program, and I wrote that first novel as my PhD, like dissertation. You could do a creative one. And a good friend of mine was working at that time. She cleaned houses and packed up people when they were ready to move. And so she was helping to move the writer Lee Smith, which was in my friend, being my good friend, said, "My friend Karen just wrote this novel. Would you read it for her?" And I was like, "Oh my God, you asked Lee
I
Smith that."
know.
And then, so, but I did. I sent Lee Smith this document that was my dissertation, and with it came an essay. And the essay was about the women in my mother's family, and it was about me being a mother, but never talking about being a mother. And so Smith read the essay and then the novel, and wrote me back these beautiful letters. And she said, "I really like your novel, but over here's this essay, and in this essay, there's this one part about you being a mother. Have you written about that? Why don't you write about that? This is the time of memoir. Tell me about that." And so that it became something I did. It became something I needed to do. Like around that time, sort of dream life, my body, everything was telling me, you need to remember this experience and you need to write about it and you need to understand it. Like the phone would ring and I'd think, it's going to be my son. He's looking for me. And it wasn't exactly like that. But that ended up being what happened. It was something I badly needed to do. My body told me so. My dreams told me so. And apparently, the writing of that first book told me so. So it was this really strong, strong desire. That was what that time was like. I wrote the memoir in a way different way than I write fiction. Fiction's kind of hard for me. I'm not a great active, plot person in some way. I write language, but memoir, there's the story. And it's like peeling back layer after layer after layer of yourself until you find the center, this heart that you really need to confront. And I needed to do that. I really did. And I did find a lot of peace by the time I came to the end of that writing. And then, of course, the story happened that I told you about it a minute ago. Then my son's girlfriend found me and sort of opened the story up all over again. And you think peace is there, but then peace is there in a different way than you thought it would be. I guess I wrote the memoir thinking about a baby I surrendered for adoption when I was 15. And instead, here was this grown man who was like, "Oh, you want to meet me? How interesting," or something like that. Like at the time, I had this copy of the book on my computer, and he wanted to see it. So I sent it to him, and he never said anything ever. And so finally I said, "Did you read it?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what did you think?" And he said, "It was all right." And I was like, "Oh my God." So I don't know. Peace is like a
Yeah.
relative term, I guess.
Well, and I see how some of the themes in this book were pulled into Wanting Radiance, your novel. And so maybe that's a good time to segue. And I realize I didn't even introduce you. I didn't even give your bio. So I'm going to give some background information right now because you mentioned having your PhD. And I don't know many creative writers that have gone on. I know Georgella Lyon has hers, and
Yeah, I've talked to her about that process. We're
yeah,
both kind of
because
mixed
I
about
mean, I
that
know when
thing.
I try to do creative writing, it's I don't know. I have to turn off the academic voice in my head, and that's hard to do. It's hard to turn off one and turn on the other.
That should be a whole other discussion
Oh,
on
yes,
Southern Salon
absolutely.
too.
You have an MFA in fiction writing from the University of Virginia, an MA in creative writing from Hollins, and a PhD from the University of Georgia. And you have written, of course, your current novel is Wanting Radiance, Walk Till the Dogs Get Mean, Meditations on the Forbidden from Contemporary Appalachia, which I totally am getting next because that sounds fascinating.
That's other
Okay.
writers from our region
Motel of
writing
the
them. Yeah.
Stars, and Strange Birds in the Tree of Heaven, and of course, Surrendered Child. You talked about writing words. Absolutely. I see that. And for me, I like plot driven. I also like literary. And I think that this, to me, when you're writing in such a poetic style, every line just, it's like a dessert for me as a reader. It's like I started putting post-it notes beside some of my favorite lines, and I gave up because there were so many. It was like I was going to have post-it notes everywhere. But you do write in such a lyric way. I'm just curious because this is such a complicated book with such intersections. It's about mothers and daughters and mothers and fathers and love and betrayal, and there's just so much going on. Can you give us some background about how this came to be, this story?
Came to be plot wise, came to be
Yes.
everything wise, I guess. Like I said with the memoir, that started with an essay that was like the prelude to turn in for a creative dissertation. Well, this too, when I was at University of Virginia, I studied fiction writing, which is a whole other story. I came there actually interested in poetry, and everybody was saying to me, friends and fellow writers, saying, your poems are really narrative. You should do fiction. So I went in the direction of fiction. While I was there, I wrote short stories. And one of them was a story called The Motel of the Stars, which became a novel, a title for a novel later on. Other things about that story were that it was set in a diner in Allen, Kentucky. I had family there, and my great aunt owned a diner, part service station she called the Black Cat. That story was set at the Black Cat Diner. My Aunt Deli was in the story. She fixed cars. My Uncle Russell was in the story. He was a faithless gambling husband. And then there was, at the time, a girl called Wadine Loving, and she was a traveler who sort of stops this beside the road place and gets a job. And then it becomes this sort of 25-page sort of tragedy about what happens, the bond between Wadine and Russell, and conflict with Delhi. And so in a way, the seed of this book was in that story, and that was years and years ago. Then I guess it evolved more. I was living by then. I had finished that time working at Hollins. It was a 1-year program working on my writing. And I was living in Asheville, North Carolina, then teaching at UNC Asheville. And I had the end of a relationship, a difficult time. And what I did in that difficult time was rely upon fortune telling. Like I had a friend who read from the Book of Changes, the I Ching. I had another friend who did tarot. And then lo and behold, somebody said, well, what you really need to do is go over to that woman over there and listen to that trailer on the outskirts of Weaverville and have your photographs read. And I thought, have my photographs read. So I went to this trailer, and this woman was like, she must have weighed 350 pounds or something like that. And you had to go back in her bedroom to give her the photographs to read because she's in the bed. She had been shot years ago by her lover, which is, doesn't bode very well for somebody who reads fortunes to have been shot by her lover. Like, didn't she know? So anyway, there was her, and she read these photographs about the lost relationship. And she looked in the photos and she said, oh, there's a lot you didn't know. Look at these shadows here. So here was another story. First, this the story at University of Virginia, the one that took place at the Black Cat Diner. Then here's this story inside me about lost love and fortune telling. So some more years passed, some other writing passed, and I have these two things, this story and this story of this fortune teller that I'd written just a little bit. And in those things began to come together for me. And that was in the time after I had done that, worked on the collection, Walk Till the Dogs Get Mean, and other things are sort of generating inside me to do with writing. And I pulled out both that story and my memories of that fortune teller, and that became the sort of seeds of this book. And then, of course, once you're in the writing, other things begin to happen and new characters and changes you never expected. The people in this book who became characters, some of them come from my family. A version of my great Aunt Deli is in this book. A version of Russell, her husband, is in this book. And then a version of a dozen people I've run across or knew or wanted to know when I lived in Eastern Kentucky, and the Eastern Kentucky I grew up with my family. I have personally lived a while now away from home. And so I pull these stories, these people out of my heart, and I write them, and I hope I'm doing them justice. I hope I'm making them real on the page, as real as they were in my life when I knew them.
It opens with the murder of a mother. A daughter witnesses her mother's murder, and then the rest of this novel is sort of a journey. She's searching for answers, right? And I think what fascinated me, is it Miracel? Is that how you pronounce her name?
Miracel. And it was sort of a made-up name, sort of like a cross between Miracle and some kind of a battery or something.
She is searching, but she also makes her living helping others who are searching. And the fortune telling, reading of the palms, reading of the cards, I think that's an interesting twist, that she's searching, but people come to her to find answers. And I don't know that that's a question, just an observation I had as a reader.
And it's an ironic thing, she grew up with this mother who told fortunes and did so in a pretty serious way. But as Miracel tells us quite often, she believes, she's taking advantage of the cards and of the telling of fortunes. She's doing it, sort of almost like a con job for a while as the book begins. And then the irony is that she is offering people consolation. She's offering them hope for the future, even if she doesn't believe that she's doing so. And then lo and behold, suddenly her own future starts unfurling in front of her. Ghosts speak to her, and the things she probably least believed in come back to her. They're in her face saying, okay, you want a future, look at your own.
So I was interested in why you chose
that's Miracel.
To structure the book the way that you did, jumping, moving back and forth in time, and why not tell it just in Miracel's point of view? Just talk to me about those decisions.
Well, I guess probably the first answer is me and the psychology of literature and the things I love to read the most. I mean, I did do the whole PhD world, and there are writers I love. So two of my favorite writers would be like Virginia Woolf and Jean Rhys, and they never tell things like linearly. I just love stories that aren't necessarily linear. But the other thing is that in writing this book, first, it was just Miracel's story. And, I wanted to write the story of, there's the woman back in the trailer, the big woman who told my fortune. And in my mind, she had a daughter. And it was the daughter's story, and the daughter who looked after the mother. And that's what I began writing for some time. But then that sort of evolved, and the shooting that fortune teller had undergone became the mystery here. Someone literally shoots Miracel's mother. And for a while, that was going to be the story, chapter by chapter, straightforward toward discovering who did what. But the more I wrote, I do, go back to my love of writing that's nonlinear. And before I know it, I'm wanting to know more about why. I want to go back into the past and figure out, if Miracel feels this about her mother and she wants to forget her mother, why is that so? And so before I know it, I was going into the story of Ruby, Miracel's mother, and trying to figure her out. And then if I want to know Ruby and I want to know her psychology, before I know it, I was connecting to Russell, this lover of this bad man that she loves with all her heart. And why did she love him? And what was the story of that? So one story led to another. It's sort of like digging deeper and deeper and trying to understand who's related to whom and how and why and what things. I'm always as interested, I guess, in why things happen and what they mean in our hearts and our souls, I guess, as
Absolutely.
much as in solving the mystery. That's the kind of reading I love. So it's kind of what I want to do.
Love to hear you read some of this.
I would love to do that. Thank you for asking. I was thinking about that. You were telling me that you might ask me to do so. This is a chapter in the point of view of Ruby Loving. She is the mother who is shot in the prologue of the book. But at this point, it's 1947, and it's the day of her birth. That's when this chapter opens, and I wanted to read a little bit of it. Each chapter in the book has a title, and the title of this one is Then and There. Her first memory was reaching out of darkness toward the faces of the women ready to receive her. She held back, safe in the damp, warm inside, her eyes open and already not sure of the world she was about to enter. Wait, her heart told her. Then they took hold of her hands and pulled her out into the light, into a room that smelled of tobacco and herbs, a room where her mother cried. A beautiful child, the woman said, but Esther saw right away that her daughter had more than her share of mortal flaws. Why, just look at your hands, Esther said when Ruby was 6 or 7, and sure enough, they were rough from mud in the yard, her palms threaded with fine cuts from the broom straw and catbrier she plucked behind the house. Maybe Esther wanted a son instead, Ruby grew to believe. And so she took that broom straw and wove it into things that seemed more solid than herself. She filled tiny baskets with hatched-out robin's eggs and stones as smooth as she could find. Or maybe Esther had wanted no child at all. So Ruby worked to disappear, hiding inside quilts at the end of the bed, vanishing inside closets and coats in the summer heat. Her hands were so far from her own body, she saw them as two lost things she no longer wanted. If there was such a thing as a mother's love, Ruby saw it fall through Esther's fingers like rusty water, and if the world held beauty, Esther kept it too close. She pulled the clothes all clean off the line and breathed their scent when she thought no one saw. And she kept bottles in all the colors she could find, blue and red and brown, hung by twine across the kitchen window to catch all the light coming in. Late evening she sat at the mirror by the dresser, her own slender hands parting strands of her hair to make a long braid. Tell me about love, Mama, Ruby said as she wound stray bits of thread on a spool. There's no such thing, Ruby said. There's only God. God decided how cold that winter would be. He fixed the summer day so hot you couldn't touch a doorknob in the outside of the house. He made autumn so lonely Ruby stared off at a sound. She sat on the porch while her daddy sang songs so beautiful they melted the air. He tuck a fiddle underneath his chin, sing songs from deep in his belly. They were ones he wrote about love. Ruby wished it were so, wished love was the way the world was. The air in the house was thick as water, and underneath that water she tried to breathe. He fiddled songs late into the night while Esther slept. Never, she said, remembering her dreams. While he played, Ruby held on to thunder as it traveled over top the ridge. The light from Radiance, the streets and their houses, stores and their shelves filled with movie star magazines. What she did those nights was teach herself to read cards. She laid out rounds of aces and hearts from her daddy's poker deck. Cards had power. Cards could tell your future if you just learned how. Ruby turned the cards one by one and let them tell about places and times she'd never seen. She held a card balanced on the end of her forefinger like it was something she'd someday need bad at the end of a long road, and she knew already what it was. Love, a prize to equal her heart.
That is so
And
powerful.
that's,
It's so beautifully written, but the hand imagery really
oh,
comes through.
thank you.
Hands and fingers and from the catching of the baby all the way up to the reading of the cards.
Gosh, I grew up with such hands in my life. I don't know if you did, but I mean, I've written more than one essay just about hands that I remember, like my granny's hands. I can just see her. She had this knife that she'd used so much; it was thin and sharpened so many times it was
Mhm.
almost, just a sliver. I can see her hands peeling potatoes, or I can see my other granny's hands scrubbing clothes, or I can see, just so many hands, like Deli's hands. I can see my aunt's hands.
I grew up with so many generations, and I think hands are one part of the body that really tell your story. You can look at hands, and you can almost see someone's story there.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, and scars, and then how much hands look like they've worked hard or not,
right,
how
and
they are,
is in this particular story because of this idea of the future being there. The future being read on the hands, not just what's been done in the past, but what's in the future.
and it's
Hmm.
on the palms of your own hands if you only know
Right.
how to look. Yeah, for one thing, it's just a word I've loved for a long time. To begin with, though, that was not the title of the book. It was originally Wanting Inez, and there is a town in this book, as you'll recall, Inez, and that's where Miracel goes early in her journey that she undertakes. Um, Inez was it's a town that's in others of my books. It's in Strange Birds in the Tree of Heaven, and it's in Motel of the Stars. But I don't know, it began to not feel like the right title. It didn't feel like it embraced enough of what Miracel was after. I don't think she was just after that town, Inez. That was not the town that, told her anything in the end. It told her a piece of the journey, but not all of it. I wanted her to be after something unspoken almost,
Hmm.
a thing that is deeper, the deepest thing inside herself that's kind of like peace or forgiveness or love or any of those things. Maybe something that words can't even give you. And so Radiance appealed to me. Radiance is also it was a little tiny, tiny town. I went to school at Berea
Oh,
College,
yes,
and we'd
yes.
always, my friends and I, go junk store looking. I don't know if you ever went to junk stores. Junk stores were the thing to do, and we'd go to this junk store, and in my memory, it was in Radiance. In this junk store, there'd be this big, huge pile of shoes, and a lot of them were antique shoes, and you could go through the shoes till you found the shoes you wanted, and that was Radiance. So I took that town's name for the title.
You have such an eye for details. I mean, incredible details. And I caught myself thinking, how did she think of that particular image? How did she think of that particular thing to insert into a scene? And it's almost like you're walking through an antique store or a junk store, or you're walking and you're taking notes or you're taking pictures. And do those come to you, or do you collect scenes in life when you're walking around?
Things. I mean, right now I'm sitting in my little tiny study that's piled up with books and things all over the place. Like right now, I'm looking at the windowsill, and here we have a wooden goddess from a temple I long ago traveled, and it came from one of those journeys. And I mean, there's crystals. There's a little china cup with Goofy and Donald Duck on it. So I'm like a bad on collecting stuff. But, I think it's also just like looking. I think that, I do live so far from the mountains and I miss it so bad. Like, so when I go there, these journeys home, it's like I'm there and I want to collect in my head every little thing that I can, so that when I go back home again, I still have the place inside me, and I can take those things I've seen out of my brain and my heart and look at them and feel like home is with me. And, I guess part of it looking at stuff. I grew up as an only child.
Are you working on another I think I read that
Yes.
you're working on essays now, a collection of essays.
Well, I do have it's a small collection of older, very short essays that's going to come out from Iris Press. Iris is in Oak Ridge, near Knoxville, Tennessee. Do you know those people? They do Bob and Beto Cumming. They do books of poetry and do some prose. And that book's going to come out in late spring 2021, and it's called Voice Lessons. But I also have been writing longer essays in the process of writing Radiance, which took just some years, like about 7 of them. I wrote in between these other long essays. And so I think I'm also going to be looking at those and seeing if in some way they relate to one another and if they could make another collection of essays. And essays seem to be what I'm doing right now. I sure would love to do another long work, though. In a way, though, with the world the way it is, I've been kind of holding my breath or breathing slowly and trying to just be still and see what comes.
It's so great to reconnect with you, and
Amy,
and I'm just so excited
much
to share this wonderful book and your writing in general with people, because you really are one of my favorite writers, and can't say enough about how much I just took time to savor. It's not, there are painful moments in the story, but the writing is really something to savor.
Well, I think that the world can be dark, but I think that writing itself is an act of beauty. And God, thank you so much for talking with me today.